Adventist History CarTalks number 17 with Pastor Kevin Morgan.
Well, taking a walk on this past Sabbath in Collegedale, I ran into an acquaintance on the internet who works at It Is Written, and he asked me about one of my posts on Ellen White Reconsidered. It was just a little note that I posted there about Jan Loughborough's work as a historian. And he was puzzling why I was acknowledging that some modern historians who were Adventists have called Loughborough's histories into question. So I took a brief moment to explain that, and he also took me over to the It Is Written facilities, and I got to see the plant and how it functions, and the recording studios and so on. And it was a very nice trip, and he also shared with me some ideas about what he is planning to do, even independent of It Is Written, to share some information on the internet. And I think it's going to be exciting what he plans to do, but I'll let him make those announcements. But let me explain a little bit about Jan Loughborough. Loughborough has been noted as being our first historian. And that is not to say that he is prepared as a historian or that he had the education of a historian. Today, to become a historian, generally you take a lot of background in history and you understand how to use historiographies and proper notation and documentation of your sources. And it is much more of a technical field. But Loughborough's contribution was during a time that Seventh-day Adventists were more concerned about spreading the message than recording where they had been. Ellen White had the foresight to record notes of some of her work, and you can see that in a very brief synopsis of her experience in her first book, but then she began to expand that in the second volume of Spiritual Gifts. And she goes into some of her earlier background, and then her early experience, her early visions, the spreading of the message, and then she picks up with her life with James, and they married and accepted the Sabbath and continued to spread the work. And that is a historical work that gives at least a perspective on her ministry, but not of the broader ministry. The other historical notes that we have are mostly notes of meetings that are going to be taking place, and those are announced in the Review and Herald, and then sometimes a little follow-up. But James is not so interested in giving great detail. He's very to the point, and most of his writing is on biblical subjects. So that's the major focus. And it takes Loughborough to begin writing about the history, the early history, and it's somewhat a part of that focus is on Ellen White's ministry. He did not become a Seventh-day Adventist until 1852. Now, we say Seventh-day Adventist, that is a Sabbath-keeping Adventist, because they were not called Seventh-day Adventist until 1861 and officially organized in 1863. But Loughborough joined 1852, had a remarkable experience, because he had a dream ahead of time about the meeting that he was going to attend with J.N. Andrews. And John Andrews was a young preacher. He was presenting the Sabbath, and Loughborough had written out his questions. And remarkably, in the dream and in reality, Andrews responded to each of the texts that were questions for Loughborough. And he was very impressed that God was leading and that it was biblically sound. And so he had just accepted the Sabbath when Ellen White returned with James White from some travels and came back to Rochester, which is where Loughborough was working. He had some relatives there, and he was selling what are called window sashes. It's the little connection that locks a window, and there was a special window sash that he was distributing, selling. But he had accepted the Sabbath. This was his first Sabbath, after his first Sabbath, and they came back. On that very occasion, Ellen White had a vision. On that very occasion, they had prayed for an individual who was healed. So it was a remarkable experience for him. And he was able to see Ellen White in vision, recognizing that there were special signs about it, and then there was a three-part message that was given for two individuals besides himself. And I won't go into all of that right now, but with that background, Loughborough began to take account. Now, he had notebooks. Unfortunately, some of his notebooks only began later, but he began writing out our history. And in 1866, Uriah Smith, who was by then the editor of the Review and Herald, requested that he write about some of the remarkable experiences that he had seen in his experience watching Ellen White in vision and observing the practical nature of her ministry. And so in 1866, he recorded that first experience that he had in 1852 and how that it had impacted the lives of three individuals. Two that had secret matters in their lives that no one else knew. One was a moral issue, one was a spiritualistic issue, and then the third person was himself. And for him, it was a matter of decision that he had to make about his ministry, what he was going to do, because he was selling the window sashes. And each of those messages was pressed in. It was something that Ellen White could not have known. And he wrote about that in that first article, but he also wrote in that article about what he had witnessed in 1861, when the country was facing the breakup of the Union. And Ellen White's vision in Parkville, Michigan, that Civil War was going to break out, even though there was debate at the time whether it was really going to happen. South Carolina had seceded. A lot of people assumed, well, everybody knew. No, everybody didn't know. And he described how a physician who was also a spiritualist was then present at the meeting. And that was the beginning of his writing on experiences in the early movement and Ellen White's ministry and prophetic messages for the individuals and for the church. He continued to write. And then after a number of the individuals in the church had passed away, some of the early ones, like Joseph Bates, who was the pioneer on the Sabbath, and he had passed away in 1872, and then many others were of the early pioneers in the Advent movement who passed away. Ellen White urged Loughborough to write out some of that early history. And so he began writing about the Advent movement, published a book, and then updated it later, including many of these stories and other events that had taken place. And he relied on the best sources that were available to him at the time, and that was the eyewitnesses of these events, people who had been present when Ellen White was in vision. And so he gathered up some of the first eyewitnesses' accounts of Ellen White in vision, and how on many occasions she did not breathe, or that she had strength that couldn't be resisted. Many different things that he would write about, and about the foreknowledge that she had of people before anybody could clue her in as to what was going on in a community. And those books were our first history books, compiling that information with the idea that it would help the next generation to know about the first generation of Adventists and what they had been through. So the question arises in this time, because many of our historians within the church have been trained in the methodology of history, which uses sources that were not available to Loughborough, that one can find minor discrepancies in his account when you can corroborate issues and historical facts. But the one thing we can say is that Loughborough did not make up these stories out of whole cloth. These are not fabrications. These are eyewitnesses. And when eyewitnesses recount things, sometimes they conflate ideas or assume certain things. So we can find some minor discrepancies in his accounts. For example, when he describes William Foy, as he's telling the stories, in the story of William Foy, he assumes, because no one knows what happened to William Foy, that he passed away shortly after the Advent movement, and he had shared his visions. But later historical research has been able to track down his gravesite. We know when he passed away. We know that he continued to pastor as a minister, but not within the Seventh-day Adventists or within the Adventists, either one. And so there's a discrepancy, but it's out of naivete. He did not know that that had happened, and it was an assumption. But that doesn't change the fact that William Foy actually had visions, that they were published, that Ellen White visited some of those meetings with her father and heard those visions presented. So it doesn't really change that matter. Another story, which I'm still trying to corroborate, but enough parts of it I can corroborate, is when James and Ellen White went to Oswego, New York, and there they were publishing the periodicals for the time. It was a form of the Review and Herald, an early form of it. And this would take us back to the winter of 1849-1850. And within that community, there were some people who joined the church. And this is prior to Loughborough's personal knowledge. Remember, he joined James and Ellen White in 1852, so 1850 precedes his time. And I can identify the individual who shared this information with him, and the man did not know that there was a couple who's in one of the stories, the Patches. He did not know that they were already married. He assumed that they were just engaged. And so that's a minor detail that Loughborough, using a secondhand source, did not know, and marriage records and that sort of thing were not available to him to verify. So we can do that now. So to judge him on the basis of that he's repeating something that somebody else had told him that proves to be incorrect, does not make him a bad historian from the point of view of those who knew it. The fellow who shared with him the information wouldn't have known any better himself. So those kinds of details occasionally are mistakes, but I would have to tell you, talking with a young Seventh-day Adventist historian, Michael Campbell, that every historian is embarrassed at times to learn that what they reconstructed of the past was not 100% accurate. As I'm working through, and I don't need to call names, but as I use historical sources from my peers, people that are still doing history today, I find errors in their work because they just didn't have access to some source that I was able to find. And when I redo my materials, I find sometimes there are flaws within my materials and conclusions that I have drawn that were not warranted if I knew all of the information. And all you can do to reconstruct the past is do your best with the information that's made available to you. So if we're going to fault Loughborough, we can also fault modern historians who do the very same things based on the limitations of their sources. And I have made the point recently that a lot of our historians live within a certain bubble of their peers who have certain views that they share. They have accepted as fact certain conclusions about Ellen White and her ministry. And within that echo chamber, they make what I consider to be false observations about her. And that's another matter. So if you have a human historian, there will be limitations on what they're able to report. And some of it has to do with bias, some of it has to do with sourcing, and some of it has to do with relying upon a previous historian who also may not have had all of the information. But that's an explanation about Loughborough, and I would like to recommend that you read Loughborough's work. It is faith-building. It will fill in details that you may not have understood because your view of Ellen White may be jaded or slanted based on the person who told you, whether a supporter or a detractor. It's best to go back to the original sources, best to read her writings for yourself, and if you want to know the history from one who lived through it and actually took notes and contacted people who lived through it, there's a special advantage in reading from J.N. Loughborough. Happy you could join us for this little car talk.